Chernobyl is the most famous nuclear disaster in the world. The Duga Radar is the most famous over-the-horizon radar array in the world. And not only is it a few miles away from Chernobyl, but it's also very inefficient. What happens when you put two and two together? A crazy conspiracy theory wrapped in another conspiracy, bagged in the revolution of Ukraine? What the fuck? Yep, we're going deep on this one, and it's going to be an interesting story. We all know the crazy theory that the CIA somehow planted a bomb in the reactor of Chernobyl Unit 4, and caused the explosion that way. That's Russia's way of deflecting responsibility away from themselves. Similar to denying that the positive scram effect actually existed. This is Ukraine's version of that theory. Deflecting blame directly to Russia. And I know it's quite popular among some groups of my viewers, who have repeatedly spammed my comments denouncing my work and asking people to watch a video focused on this version of events. To those people, this video is dedicated to you. So, to recap, for those who haven't seen my Dugga video, the radar was not very effective, despite being the Soviet Union's primary method of detecting a mass missile attack from the eastern coast of the United States. To give you an idea of how bad, the commanders and crew operating were given high awards for detecting the Challenger explosion. Its odds of detecting a first strike were estimated at about 50-50. Here's where our conspiracy begins. Enter Vasily Shamshin, who had become the Minister of Communications for the USSR when the radar became operational. Shamshin had also been involved with the Dugga project from the start, and by April of 1986, he was scared. The project was due for review in a few months, and knowing that it would inevitably fail, he knew his ability to advance in the Communist Party would be toast. This is where he conspires with a friend of the history side of the channel. Not literally, but figuratively. Georgy Kopchinski, the director of the Soviet Central Committee on Nuclear Energy. And Kopchinski had decided he was going to make Unit 4 have a meltdown. Intentionally. But how does one do this? Well, as we all know, Chernobyl had been operating at half power for most of the day, and this means that xenon inside the core increased, which makes it more unstable and prone to accidents, like Leningrad in 1975. Enter Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Unlike most stories of this night, this version of Dyatlov is surprisingly hesitant to conduct the experiment, because he's aware of the danger. Kopchinski, however, is hell-bent on forcing Dyatlov to do the experiment. A phone call from Moscow offering retirement or promotion to Chief Engineer of Chernobyl MPP-2 was made. For those who don't know, as Bryukhanov was struggling to keep control of just the first 4 units, and Pripyat in his hands, and not lose them to the Communist Party, and Fomin was just returning to work after his car crash that broke his coccyx, they were pretty stuffed. So they were planning to turn Units 5 and 6 into a separate nuclear power plant under a different administration. Dyatlov, under duress, decides to conduct the experiment anyway. Reactor power drops, but they can pull it back up, and then at the end of the experiment, they press the shutdown button, and the reactor runs away under the positive scram effect. Kopchinski's intentional meltdown has spiraled into a reactor explosion. Shamshin got what he wanted, and more than he could have imagined on top. Not only was the inspection of the Duga radar delayed, it was cancelled indefinitely, as the site was eventually abandoned due to the radiation levels on the military base. Kopchinski escaped guilt, despite knowing his orders put the reactor in an unstable position, and eventually blew the reactor sky high. Dyatlov, however, was unable to escape culpability. He was found guilty in the trial, of course, but no mention of the phone call ever came up. Dyatlov would never mention the phone call, and he would take the secret to his grave. Or so they all thought. Because one man did have access to the phone logs that night, and they were more than happy to spill the beans. For the truth, as he called it. Vladimir Komarov, a member of the government commission investigating the disaster, sat on the truth, as he called it, for 20 years. The guilt building and building until eventually he told the press. Kopchinski, of course, has denied this. But another person, trying to explain the causes for why the power would be raised again after midnight, took the suggestion of Komarov and ran with it as well. Boris Ivanovich Gorbachev, a prominent Ukrainian nuclear physicist who worked inside the Chernobyl sarcophagus, began popularizing this version of events. And Gorbachev is no small-time scientist either. Ever since the 2000s, Gorbachev has been publishing on some of the biggest Ukrainian and Russian nuclear power forums, and even managed to sneak his way onto the Russian Wikipedia page. All this time, he penned an alternative version of the accident where the operators raised the power without care until it ran away, and they were forced to scram. So, to summarise, failing Dugga plus corrupt nuclear scientist, plus government scientist, plus a government scientist from a different country, equals crazy theory. Is there any truth to it? Let's go person by person in this conspiracy. First Shamshin, then Kopchinski, then Dyatlov, then Komarov, and then finally Gorbachev. So, Vasily Shamshin. What work did he do on Dugga? How involved was he in the creation of the radar? Well, he co-wrote a paper on the concept of the Duga Radar in 1961, but it wasn't his idea. He was in fact the assistant to its real creator, Efim Steyren, and then he left it. He was too busy working through the 70s developing the world's first satellite TV system, and pioneering it. Orbiter was his brainchild. Ekran, a direct satellite system, was switched online in 1976 at a cost of 400 million rubles, but functioned across the entirety of Russia for 30 years. Shamshin had almost nothing to do with Dugga. It didn't matter if it failed or not. Not to mention his only work was concept on the prototype in Mykolaiv, on the north coast of the Black Sea. So, Shamshin's out. On to Kopchinski. Kopchinski could not have known that the reactor was unstable. Not even Brekhanov knew the reactor was running at that point. And here's the real kicker. Unit 4 was actually more stable at midnight than it was when the experiment was delayed. There is so much information about the rundown and how crazy it was that wouldn't fit into the video. But it's out there, and the point is that it was a mess. In the delay, the concentration of xenon in the core decreased as fission burned it away, which can be seen in graphs of control rod insertion on April 25th and 26th, increasing throughout the day until they began to reduce the power again for the experiment, at which point the control rod insertion decreases, to compensate for xenon buildup. Did Kopchinski know about the positive scram effect? Yes. He said himself he found out about it when working at Smolensk nuclear power plant, Chernobyl's younger sister. But he also knows that the fix for the positive scram had been rolled out at Smolensk, and other RBMK reactors. The only one that hadn't, something he would never possibly know, due to the bureaucracy involved in creating this fix, was Chernobyl Unit 4. The more you know. There's also little things. Kopchinski was at home, asleep, when the explosion occurred, and had no method of communicating with the control room that night. To reach it from outside the power plant, you had to use a switchboard, which was very conveniently recorded by the KGB, and logged in files. We have everything, from calls about who would be monitoring which pumps, to the Unit 3 control room calling Yevchenko in his storeroom for a stretcher. There's no call on the switchboard to the control room by Kopchinski. The only person today who could know definitively about the phone call is the person who owns the recording. And at one point that happened to be Nikolai Steinberg. Now, Steinberg has publicly released many documents in recent years, but this is not one of them. It's unknown if he still has access, however we do know this. Steinberg is steadfast on the causes of the disaster, and it has nothing to do with a phone call. He trusts Kopchinski so much, they actually co-authored one of the best books on the Chernobyl disaster together. Oh, Dyatlov. Where would we be without a misrepresentation of your character? Normally, it's a complete deflection of your own culpability, and inventing bullying on the night of the disaster. This time, you're a careful boss who didn't want to do the rundown, but was pressured into it. Dyatlov was a tough man, and open that he didn't understand the RBMK. An enigma, he called it. But he was fully committed to doing the rundown. And how did it end? An explosion. Now, they are right that Dyatlov would never accept blame, but he didn't accept it for any of the operators either. Dyatlov attacked purely the design of the reactor, arguing that what they did was completely in line with the regulations at the time, going to great lengths to defend the legacy of the likes of Akimov and Toptonov. Even with Steinberg after the disaster, he clashed over this matter. Why do I bring this up? There is no better defense against your blame and the blame of your colleagues than the fact you were forced to do it under duress to conduct an experiment you didn't want to conduct. And yet, nowhere in his books or interviews does Dyatlov mention this phone call. In fact, he's very open about readily approving and going along with the rundown. It's the complete opposite behaviour you would expect of someone fighting so hard to expose the truth, making a bigger lie. Now, why would Vladimir Komarov lie about the existence of this phone call? If we rewind the clocks a few years to when Kopchinski was the director of Smolensk nuclear power plant, we get our answer. Komarov used to work under Kopchinski, and was desperate to be promoted to head of the research department. But Kopchinski passed him over, effectively derailing Komarov's career. Let's speculate. In the end, this came back to bite Kopchinski, as years later Komarov got involved with the investigation into the causes of the accident, and found an opportunity to get back at Kopchinski by diverting the blame for the disaster on the one man who ruined his career. I cannot say this for certain, but what I can say is that, again, Steinberg had access to these phone calls as well, and he has never even suggested this as a possibility. And finally, who is Boris Gorbachev? Is he really this prominent scientist that worked in the sarcophagus as he claimed? Well, there's a big difference between what Gorbachev says and what Gorbachev does. Gorbachev says he's important, and claims to have published on some of the biggest nuclear websites in the world. That is true if you count the Slavutich City website and nonuclear.ru, a Russian anti-nuclear site, It's less true when you publish on sites dedicated to UFO sightings, and a website called Bible for You. It appears he did work at the sarcophagus, as there is someone by the name of Boris Gorbachev who posted a recount of their time working in the shelter, but only as a secretary. And Boris's claim of working at the Ukrainian Institute of Safety becomes very interesting, given that the institute doesn't appear to be a part of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. In summary, he's a serial liar. And he's been shown up for it before. He tried to debate Steinberg and Kopchinski. Keep in mind he's accused Kopchinski of being one of the major culprits of the disaster, and failed miserably. Needless to say, Gorbachev has been absent online since the early 2010s, and I doubt he'll return to this side of the internet for a while. But we still cannot escape one key thing about this story, and that is its popularization. The 2015 documentary The Russian Woodpecker, a film that blends conspiracy and real events, as it was filmed during the Euromaidan protests that spilled into the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And the star of this documentary, Fedor Alexandrovich, is very open that he was being harassed by the police while he was making the documentary. The kind of problem, he was told, that would get him killed. And he wasn't wrong. The cinematographer was almost killed by a sniper while filming around the protests for the documentary. And this brings us on to the big point. The documentary is objectively anti-Russian. Ukraine was going through a major anti-Russian protest, which the government was sided against. That is the kind of problem that gets you killed, not the theory itself. In the end, Fedor goes up on the stage on Independence Square, accusing Chernobyl of being an intentional crime against the Ukrainians, and the documentary wraps up. It's an interesting watch, and I do recommend people watch it at some point, but it will now be impossible to escape its association with Ukrainian nationalism. Is the suggestion even correct? Did the Soviet government directly play a role in the Chernobyl disaster? What we can say is that the factors that would lead to the disaster were known to the Kurchatov Institute and Nikiet, and attempts to stop them before 1986 were small and by the nuclear power plants themselves. There was a deliberate attempt to alleviate these same institutions of guilt in 1986, culminating in INSAC 1, but the order was never deliberate, and the events that would ultimately lead to Unit 4 being in that situation, the rundown, were hardly known to those in charge, including the man directing Chernobyl. What an interesting conspiracy, if it was true. However, it's not, and it can now be put to rest with all those crazy stories told about this one night in April of 1986.